All right, Shabbos say good morning, good morning. Let us begin a beautiful daf ahead of us today. Begin by thanking all of our sponsors. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Adar. Stephen Teri Czinn for dedicating all of his Shumer Drushos this month in memory of Teri's father, Dr. Harry Kahn, Tzvi Hirsh ben Yosef HaKohen. Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all of his Shumer Drushos this month in memory of Paul's grandfather, Zechariah ben Zechariah, and grandmother, Dinah bas Dov. Our week of learning sponsors, an anonymous sponsorship, Le'iloi nishmas, Moshe Aharon Alter ben Yosef Binyamin, and Sara Deena bas Elimelech. Our Daf Yomi sponsor today, Adam Plunka, in commemoration of the yartzeit of Moshe Rabbenu. I'll say again, a great zechus, of course, to learn the Torah that Moshe Rabbenu gave us so many years ago. Everything we have is because of Moshe Rabbenu. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the neshama will have an aliyah. We'll say in the merit of all of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshama should have an aliyah, and the families ein achama. And we'll say with that, let us begin. So really interesting daf ahead of us today. So we'll say today's daf is Lamed Vav 36, and we are picking up in Yahrzeit Hashem at the two dots on the bottom of Lamed He with base 35b, three lines up on the bottom. Rabbi Yochanan. So we'll say, remember again, just a word of background before we begin today. So remember again, the Mishnah introduced us to the idea that in order for a Nazir to be in violation ultimately of his neder nazirus, again, there are three different categories of violation. Focusing now on the prohibition to consume wine. So remember again, the Rabbi Akiva introduced us to this idea as follows: that generally consumption of wine, liquid, right? Liquid measures usually a revius, right? So therefore, a Nazir drinks a revius of wine. Ultimately, he's going to be in violation. If he eats grapes, right, or for that matter, congealed wine, which we'll discuss as well. So, right, the halacha is how much does he have to consume? A kizayis. If you remember again, Rabbi Akiva introduced us to this idea in the Mishnah of afilu shara pita bayayin v'yesh b'kedei l'sarif kizayis chayiv. Rabbi Akiva introduced this idea that halacha l'maisa, let's say you took a piece of bread and you dipped the bread in wine. So we'll say, so now what happened? Let's say as a result the bread expanded and now you have a kizayis. So what's the halacha? Or whatever. Yeah, you have a kizayis now. And that kizayis is comprised of what? Bread and wine. Rabbi Akiva said, you're chayiv. And I will say, what's the chiddush in that statement? The chiddush in that statement is that heter mitztaref le'isser. Namely, again, that you could have permitted substance combined with prohibited substance to form the requisite shear of prohibition. Now, I will say, now that is really a very dramatic chiddush if you think about it. Because remember, what that says is, and I will say, what's even more dramatic about it is, does Rabbi Akiva bring down ratios? At least not in the Mishnah, he doesn't. Which sounds like potentially, maybe even if you have a lot more heter than isser, as long as there's some isser in there, the heter and the isser combine to form the requisite shear of isser, and you'd be chayiv. So we'll say that's what we're going to focus on a little bit today, this concept of heter mitztaref le'isser. Permitted substance could combine with prohibited substance in order to form the requisite shear of prohibition. Says the Gemara. We'll say three lines from the bottom. Lamed Hem and Beis. Amram Yavo, Amram Yochanan. So we'll say this is the position of Rabbi Yochanan. Kol Yisurin Sheva Torah ein heter mitztaref le'isser. So let's listen to this. Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion that Allah Kamais in general, when it comes to most isurim in the Torah, heter does not combine with isser. Permitted substance does not combine with prohibited substance to form the requisite shear. Chutz mi'isuri neder. The exception to the rule is Nazir. The exception to the rule is Nazir. Why? Shari Amra Torah Mishras. So I will say it's very interesting. Why? Because when it comes to Nazir, the Torah uses the word Mishras. And I will say the pasuk the Gemara is quoting over here is Miyayin Shechar Yazir Chometz Yayin Chometz Shechar Lo Yishta V'Chom Mishras Anavim Lo Yishta. I will say, what is that phrase? V'Chom Mishras Anavim. Mishras means literally anything soaked in grapes. I will say, what does that mean? What does it mean soaked in grapes? So Rabbi Yochanan will say, obviously what that must be referring to is what? You take a permitted substance, you soak it in grapes, now it becomes a kizayis. The halacha is heter mitztaref le'isser. So Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion that in general throughout Torah, we do not say heter mitztaref le'isser. The exception to the rule is Nazir, because the Torah itself goes out of its way to discuss Mishras. I will say if you take a quick look at the Rush, so the Rush says over here, last Rush on the page, Chayiv al Shrias Pito Bayayin, V'idika Kizayis Miyayim Mechudei Lama Likra. So I will say, so what the Rush is saying is, what Rabbi Yochanan is saying is, if we're talking about a case where there's a kizayis of wine by itself, then I don't need a pasuk for that. Obviously, must be talking about a case where Allah Chalamai said the kizayis in question is made up of heter as well as iser. Fine. So let's go back to the top of Lamed Vav. Zeiri Amar, Zeiri says, Af Sa'ar Bebal Taktiru. So we'll say, Zeiri says that there's another, so we'll say, it's interesting. So ultimately, again, Zeiri will say, so let's just plot our opinions over here. Rabbi Yochanan, the concept of heter and starif le'iser only applies to Nazir, doesn't apply to anywhere else. Why Nazir? Mishras. Zeiri says it also applies to Sa'ar. And I will say, what's the prohibition of Sa'ar? If you take a look at the first Rush on the Daf, left-hand column, the Rush says, Af Sa'ar b'val tatiru, nami heter and starif le'iser, im hiktir chatzi zayis chomitz, the chatzi zayis matzah imo. So we'll say, now listen to this. The halacha is, you're not allowed to offer up chametz on the mizbeach. You can't offer up chametz on the mizbeach. However, what happens if halacha l'maisa, you offer up a combination, half the kizayis of chametz, together with half the kizayis of matzah? So Zeiri says, in that case, halacha l'maisa, heter mitztaref le'iser. In fact, it will combine. So Zeiri is saying it's not only by Nazir, it's also by the prohibition to offer up chametz on the mizbeach. So the Gemara says, Kiman, where do you get that from? In other words, what is that? What is that? I will say now, I'll just point out over here something very interesting. If you take a look first at Rashi on the right-hand column over here, She'ilu ein bisar kizayis v'isa mashlimo l'kizayis shu chayiv v'over mishum shenemar kol sar v'chol devash lo saktiru. Okay, so we'll say, so that's it. The pasuk says, you're not allowed to offer up chametz. So if you went ahead and you offered up a half a kizayis of chametz, combined with a half a kizayis of matzah, because matzah is offered up on the mizbeach, right? Ultimately, also when we say matzah just means unleavened items, not necessarily matzah like we're thinking about, but for example, a carbon mincha could be offered up in the form of matzah. So let's say, for example, you're offering up half a kizayis of chametz together with half a kizayis. Just again to be clear, this chametz has nothing to do with Pesach. Right? Not Pesach, right? We'll come to Pesach in just a little bit. This is just karbanos. There's a prohibition to bring chametz on the mizbeach the entire year. Now you're taking a half a kizayis of chametz, mixing it together with a half, although the Rosh doesn't have to be mixed, but a half a kizayis of chametz together with half a kizayis of matzah, offering it up on the mizbeach. Zeiri says you're going to be chayiv. Why? Heter mitztaref le'iser. Why would that apply over here? Listen to this. Kiman Rabbi Eliezer. Didarish kol. So let's say, listen to this. Rabbi Eliezer holds, it's actually very interesting. Rabbi Eliezer holds, he darshans the word kol. Now we'll say, what's the kol? So now a third topic. The third topic that's being introduced here is chametz. Chametz. Now watch this. Rabbi Eliezer darshans kol. I'll take a look at the Rush for just a moment. I'm sorry, so we're going to jump back and forth between the Rush and Rashi a little bit. So the Rush says, Kiman Rabbi Eliezer, Didarish kol, beperek kol hamenachos, Tanya, ki kol soar v'chol devash lo saktiru. Einli ela kulo, perish kol hakometz, dahainu beis zeisim, the savra in kometz pachos mi beis zeisim, miktsas minyan chazi kometz, dahainu zayis kol. Eruva minayin, perish chazi zayis sar. So we'll say, so essentially, Rabbi Eliezer darshans. Now I just want to point out something very interesting over here. According to the Rush, the kol that they're referring to is the kol by the prohibition to offer up chametz on the mizbeach. According to Rashi, the kol that is being referenced over here is the kol machmetzes lo sochelu by chametz on Pesach. Either way, it actually doesn't matter so much for our purposes right now. The point over here that's happening over here is, but let's just keep with chametz on the mizbeach. By chametz on the mizbeach, the Torah says kol machmetzes, right? Any type of chametz can't be offered up. Rabbi Eliezer says, what does the word kol come to teach you? The word kol comes to teach you what I was saying. Any little bit of chametz. Any little bit of chametz. Even if what? Even if it's not a full kizayis of chametz, a partial kizayis or a partial amount of chametz could combine with matzah to form the prohibited shear. That's the position of Zeiri combined with Rabbi Eliezer. So, okay, Rabbi says, let's read it again. Kiman, Rabbi Eliezer, the Darish Kol. Fine. So Rabbi says, so let's just keep track of what we have. So far, we have Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan holds in general, do we say hetem mitzaref le'isser? Rabbi Yochanan? No. The only time it applies is where? Nazir. Nazir. Fine. Why does it apply by Nazir? Mishras. Good. Ziri comes along and says, no, it also applies by the prohibition to offer up chametz on the mizbeach. Why? Because he passes like Rabbi Eliezer, and namely what? Kol. The word kol comes to include even a partial measure of kizayis, of chametz, that it combines with heter. Now watch a second. The Gemara says, well, if that's the case, to ihachi li'in chametz nami. So I'll say, if that's the case, then halacha l'maisa, this same halacha should apply by chametz on Pesach. So we'll say, now look what's just happened. We've just transitioned from chametz on the mizbeach to chametz on Pesach. So if that's the case, that the word kol, we'll say if the drasha is that the word kol itself teaches you what? If the word kol teaches you that any amount of chametz could combine with heter to form the requisite shear, then ultimately that same halacha should apply to chametz on Pesach as well. Take a look at the Rush. Ihaki le'inyan chametz Pesach nami l'Rabbi Elazar heter mitzaref le'isur d'chsiv bei ki kol ochal machmetzes. To which the Gemara says, so halacha l'maisa, what should that tell me? Watch this. So what that should mean is that on Pesach, if you eat a half a kizayis of chametz combined with a half a kizayis of matzah, we should say what Rabbi say, heter mitzaref le'isur, and you should be chayiv for a consumption of a kizayis of chametz on Pesach. Why? Because what do we have by chametz on Pesach as well? Kol. To which the Gemara says, you're absolutely right. Rabbi say, yeah, it does. According to this approach, absolutely heter mitzaref le'isur, even by chametz on Pesach. To which the Gemara says, Ela lafuki me'abaye. So we'll say rather it has to come to exclude the position of Abaye. Damer, yesh haktara bepachos mikizayis. Because Abaye holds that halacha l'maisa, you could offer up on the mizbeach less than a kizayis. Kamash malan in haktara pachos mikizayis. Ultimately, again, the Gemara is coming to exclude the position of Abaye, who holds that you could offer up less than a kizayis on the mizbeach. So therefore I will say, so just to point out what we have over here so far. So we have Zeiri, right? Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, heter mitzaref le'isur only by Nazir, not by anything else, Mishras. Zeiri comes along and says, no, heter mitzaref le'isur also applies to offering up chametz on the mizbeach because of kol. The Gemara says, well, 1 second. If kol tells you that even partial shear is going to be asur because it combines, then that should apply also to chametz on Pesach. To which the Gemara says, you're absolutely right. So I will say, so now it turns out that we have 3 potential areas where we would say heter mitzaref le'isur. Nazir, which it sounds like everyone agrees in the case of Nazir, chametz on the mizbeach, and chametz on Pesach. Okay, so let's go weiter. So Yosef Rav Dimi v'kamar la hashmaisa. So we'll say Rav Dimi was sitting and he was saying over this statement of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi say Rabbi Yochanan. Remember again, going back to Nazir. Did halacha l'maisa heter mitzaref le'isur by Nazir? So therefore, again, if you take a piece of bread, soak it in wine, and now the whole thing combines to form a kizayis, ultimately you'll be chayiv, even though that kizayis is made up of bread, which is permitted. So Rav Dimi is going ahead and giving over this halacha. Eisve Abaye raised the kasha. So I'll say this is very interesting. A lot of interesting cases today. Hamikva shal truma, v'ashum v'ashem shal chol. So I'll say here's the case. You have a mikvah. Now I will say if you look at the Rush for just a moment, the Rush defines what's a mikvah. He says tafshil av. It's a cooked dish that's very thick. The kafui, and it's solid. Kafui literally means frozen. It doesn't mean frozen, it means solid. It is a thick, solid mass. Kigon daisa. So we'll say, so again, daisa in Maseches Brachos is often translated as a porridge, a thick porridge. Right? So you have a thick cooked dish. So we'll say, now watch this. So you have a mikveh. Now this is a grain-based dish. So it's made up of grain, really grain, flour. Shum is garlic, shemen is oil. Shemen is oil. So you have this porridge made up of grain, oil, and garlic. Now I'll say in this case over here, the grain part of it is truma. The oil and the garlic is chulin. Okay? Now it's all mixed together. So I'll say this is your portion. Now by the way, nothing prohibited has been done over here, right? This is totally mutter. Right? So you have a porridge made, the grain is truma, the other additives, i.e. the oil and the garlic, are of chulin. Now watch this. Here's where it gets interesting. The nagal tvul yom b'miksasan, a tvul yom comes and touches it. It's always a tvul yom. These guys cannot keep their hands to themselves, right? Just wait a few more hours. So let's remember again, who's the tvul yom? The tvul yom is a guy who is tameh, has gone to the mikvah already, but requires what? Excellent. Harav shemesh, right? Sunset. So I'll say, so now what happens? The tvul yom comes along and he touches part of this porridge. Now remember, I'll go say, a tvul yom cannot touch truma. And if he touches truma, ultimately, again, he invalidates the truma for consumption. So now the tvul yom touches porridge. Now we'll say, now what's the chap over here? The chap over here is that this is a mixture of both chulin and truma items. So what's the halacha? So the Gemara says, what's the halacha? So nagal tvul yom miksasan, tvul yom touched part of it. I'm sorry. The nagal tvul yom miksasan, pasal as kulan. So I'll say essentially the entire mixture is pasal. If you take a look at the Rush says pasal hakol the mikveh ikar utvul yom pol shas hatruma. They're both say, now what's the logic over here? So remember, we have a couple of halachas going on. Number one, just general halacha. If a tvul yom touches truma, he invalidates the truma. And I will say, remember again, in the halachas of tum and tara, what does pasal mean? Pasal means that the item itself is tameh, but what? Cannot convey tuma. That's what pasal means. When tameh means you become tameh and can convey tuma. Pasal means you are tameh but cannot convey any level of tuma. So when a tvul yom touches truma, the truma itself becomes invalidated, but the truma cannot convey tuma to anything else. Fine. But the entire mixture is now pasal. Why, I will say? What's the logic over here? So the Rush says, because remember I will say, in this mixture, what's the ikr? The grain. Right? The truma, therefore, in this case, the grain. What's the tafel? The oil and the garlic. So in this case, because the ikr is truma, therefore the mixture is defined as truma. So because it's defined as truma, therefore when the tvul yom touches it, what's the status of the mixture? Pasal. Okay, case number two. Mikvah shel chulin v'ashum v'ashem shel truma. So we'll say case number two is what happens, we'll say the reverse. Let's say the grain is chulin, but the oil and the garlic, they're truma. And now same case, the naga tvul yom mitzasan, the tvul yom touched part of the mixture. So what's the halacha? Lo pasal ela makom magao. Very interesting. The tvul yom only compromises what Rabbi say? Only compromises the area that he touched. Now, what's the good news about that? That's right, because this is a solid mass, what can you do? Scoop it out, and you're good to go on the rest of it. Rabbi say, take a look at the Rush. Actually, sorry, not yet. So Rabbi say, so that's the halacha. V'avina ba. Rabbi say, we ask about this. Makom magao amai pasal. I don't understand. Why is it that the place that the tvul yom touch is going to be problematic? Now, what's the shaila over here? Take a look at the Rush. V'avina ba makom magao amai pasal. Ha betili lehu tavlin baruba tichasaka daitcha didimu asarana. Now, let's say, I don't understand. In a case where the grain is chulin and the oil, so let's go through this. So let's go through the cases once more. Right, case number one, the grain is truma, oil and garlic is chulin. Right, tvul yom touches the mixture. What's the halacha? Whole thing is pasal. Makes sense. Why? Because truma is the primary part, is the primary ingredient in this mixture, and therefore again the mixture is looked at as a truma mixture. Tvul yom touches truma. Ultimately, the whole thing becomes pasal. Case two, the grain is chulin, oil and garlic is truma. Tvul yom touches the mixture. What's the halacha? area that he touched is problematic, the rest of it is mutter. Ask the Gemara, I don't understand. Why should the area that he touched be problematic? I will say, in this case, why don't we say that the truma ingredients are bottle to the chulin grain? In other words, the truma ingredients are the secondary items over here. Why don't we say that the truma's bottle to the chulin? I will say, what's the halacha if a tvul yom touches chulin? What's the halacha? Nothing, it's chulin. Right? So therefore, why don't we just say that this is a case of a tvul yom touching chulin, in which case nothing should be problematic, even the area that he touched. To which the Gemara says, "My pasal Amram Moshe watch this. Matam." I will say, what's the reason why when the tvul yom touches the mixture, even though again in this case the grain is chulin and the truma is only the additives, the oil and the garlic. So I'll say, watch this. Hoil v'zar loke ala b'kizayis. I will say, now watch this. Now, why is it that a tvul yom invalidates the area that he touched? Because I will say, if a non-Kohen were to eat this, if he were to eat a kizayis of this, he would get malchus. I will say, why would a non-Kohen get malchus for eating a kizayis of this mixture? Why? Because it's truma. I will say, now watch this. Now this is actually quite fascinating. I will say, take a quick look at the rush before we turn the page. Va'amar bar bachana. The dimudar isavahozar lokala because I shum the shame trumala hilchach lagabi tuma. Now fine. Actually, let's go right there. Gemara says my time. Now 1 second. Actually, before we turn the page, we'll say so. My time, right? My time. Let's build up the suspense before we turn it. Right. So we'll say now. Watch this. Gemara says, whoa. Let me get this straight. So you're telling me now, but say let's just be clear on the case. I have a mixture. I have this porridge. Right. I have this mikveh. The grain is chulin. The oil and the garlic is truma. So I'll say, so now you're telling me a tvul yom comes and touches my porridge. The area that he touched is going to be tameh. Why? Because if a non-Kohen were to come, if a zar were to come and eat this, he'd be chayiv for eating a kizayis of this mixture. Why would he be chayiv for eating a kizayis of this mixture? Because it would be a non-Kohen eating truma. Understand? If he eats a kizayis of this mixture, I will say, again, let's just play this out. A non-Kohen comes and takes a kizayis of this mixture. I will say, is he eating a kizayis of truma? No. Remember, I will say, what's the case over here? The case over here is where the grain is chulin. It's only the additives, ultimately again, of oil and garlic that are truma. I will say, do you know how much of that porridge you'd have to eat in order to actually get a kizayis of truma? That's a lot of porridge. So what do you mean he's chayav for eating a kizayis of truma? So we'll say my time, I'm a base. No, so now I understand. Lav mishum the heter mitzdaref leisser. Okay. So we'll say, so now no. So I get it. So we'll say, what? This must be a case of what? This must be a case of heter mitzdaref leisser. Right? And now I understand. In other words, we'll say, if you have heter mitzdaref leisser, so then what happens? We'll say, when you have oil and garlic of truma mixed in to the grain, so now we'll say, how do I look at that mixture? So again, I can say that when a non-Kohen eats part of that mixture, then what happens? Essentially, the heter of the grain is being mitzdaref ultimately again to the oil and to the garlic, and that's why it's as if he's eating a kizayis of truma. So the Gemara says, now again, remember, what's happening over here? So remember, we just were saying before that Allah Lamaisa, right? Rabbi Yochanan says, heter mitzdaref le'isra only applies where? The zeros. So now also remember again, Abai is raising a kasha, because from this case it appears that heter mitzdaref le'isra applies to other situations as well. Most notably, again, about saying this case, remember, just see how we're backing into this, right? The reason why if a tvul yom touches this mixture, where the grain is chulin, the oil and the garlic is truma, the area that he touched is going to be asar, is why? Because we assume that if a non-Kohen were to eat a kizayis of this mixture, he'd get malchus, he'd be chayiv. Now, why? Because he's eating kizayis of truma. But he's not eating kizayis of truma. He's not. He's eating a whole bunch of grain with some truma mixed in. it must be that the reason why a non-Kohen would be chayiv for eating a kezayis of this mixture is why? Heter Mistayif L'Isser. What do you see? That Heter Mistayif L'Isser applies to other cases other than Nazir. Beautiful. To which the Gemara says, Amar Le Lo. Now let's remember again. He said, Rabbi Dimi said, not necessarily. The reason ultimately, again, I will say, why Allah Lamaisa, a non-Kohen will be chayiv for eating this is not Mitzayif for Heter Mitzayif L'Isser. Rather, I will say, get ready for this. My Kizayis Di'ika, Kizayis Bichtei Achilas Pras. Oh. Let's say it's not true. You see, what's happening over here, something different. We'll say it's one of these very exciting Gemaras because there's a whole bunch of concepts that are being not thrown around, but that are being discussed here. So we'll say, so Rabbi Dimi says, no, Abaye, you're wrong. This is not a case of Heter Mitzayif L'Isser. Rather, again, we'll say, what is this a case of? Kizayis Bichdei Achilas Pras. Now we'll say, well, let's talk about this just a moment. There's a concept in halacha that of achilas pras, right? Rabbi say achilas pras, we saw back in Maseches Brachos, is literally again the amount of time that it takes to eat a half a loaf, right? The Gemara discusses a half a loaf of wheat bread that's not hot, that's not cold. They'll say, what's the shear of kidei achilas pras? So this is a big machlokes in halacha, anywhere between 3 and 9 minutes. The truth is, there are poskim that say even shorter than that, even longer than that, but that's the general range. So we'll say, what are we talking about over here? So, kidei achilas pras is the span, what we'll call of normal consumption. Right? The span of normal consumption. So Rav Dimi wants to suggest over here, what's the case of the mikveh? The case of the mikveh is that if a person comes and eats porridge, kidei achilas pras, eats kidei achilas pras, over the span of that time, he will eat the kizayis of truma. I will say, now that makes a lot more sense, right? Because now what he's saying is if you eat porridge for, let's say, whatever, a certain amount of time, over that time, you'll end up eating a kizayis of truma. Because of what? Because of the consumption of the oil and of the garlic. That's what it's saying over here. That's why I will say a zar would be chayiv, and that's why if a tvul yom touches this porridge, the area that he touched is going to become tameh. But Rabbi Dimi posits it has nothing to do with Heter Mitzaref L'Isser. So we'll say, so it turns out, therefore, the only way that a zar would be chayiv for going ahead and eating those porridge is how? Is if he ate the porridge for a continuous amount of time. If he ate porridge, kidei achilas pras. Let's just go for argument's sake. He eats porridge for 3 minutes, right? So 3 minutes of porridge consumption, I will say, equals what? The consumption of a kizayis of truma. Why is that? Because we assume that over the course of 3 minutes of consumption, he will consume a kizayis ultimately of oil and garlic. Good? That's the halacha. So one second. V'achilas pras dor. I see. So I'll say, so let's analyze this for just a moment. Right? Ultimately, again, is the concept of achila bichdei achilas pras. We'll say, so now, I just want to point out what this means. The concept of achila bichdei achilas pras means that any act of eating that you do in a certain amount of time ultimately combines to form one act of eating. We're about to say, by the way, you know where this comes up all the time in halacha is on Yom Kippur. Let's say a person cannot fast. For a person who has a medical condition, they can't fast. So I will say one of the things that we try to tell a person if they can't fast is that if you could, what's the word? Spread. Thank you. Spread out your act of eating or drinking over a longer amount of time. Halachically, it could be considered as if you're still fasting. For example, let's say a person needs to drink. Just give you some simple example of this. Let's say let's need to eat. Let's go with eating, right? So we'll say actually let's go with drinking, right? So again, the halacha for Yom Kippur is a cheekful. So halacha l'maisa, if you could drink less than a cheekful, 3 minutes apart. 3 minutes. I'm using 3 minutes as an example now. Say halacha l'maisa, a cheekful, which actually is not an insignificant amount of drinking. So those acts of drinking will not combine with each other. So the halacha of kidei achilas pras says that any act of eating or drinking, for that matter, that you do within a confined amount of time is counted as one intact act of eating. So therefore, I will say what's happening over here is as follows. So just to plug this back into the mikveh case, I have a porridge, right? My porridge. So obviously, if the porridge is made from truma grain and chulin, oil, and garlic, so I will say that case is not a shayla. Why is that case not a shayla? That's truma. Halacha l'maaseh, it's case number 2 that's more intriguing to me, where ultimately, again, the grain is chulin, the oil and the garlic is truma. Again, we said that if a tvol yom touches it, the place that he touched it is going to be tamei. Why? Because if a Yisrael eats this, he's going to be chayiv. What's the case where if a Yisrael eats this, he's going to be chayiv? If he eats a kizayis b'chdei achilas pras. Right, so essentially, again, halacha l'maaseh, if he eats a kizayis over a certain amount of time, we are confident that he has consumed the kizayis of truma. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, is this concept of kizayis b'chdei achilas pras a biblical concept that if a Yisrael were to eat some of this mixture, he'd actually get malchus for this? To which the Gemara says, yes, it is. So we'll say it is. Gemara says it is a biblical concept. Ihaki amai pligi rabbanon alei Rabbi Elazar bekusach habavli. We'll say kusach. Where have you been all my life? Right. So remember again, we haven't had kusach in the longest time. Right. So we'll say so now. Listen to this. If that's the case, that the concept of kizayis b'chdei achilas pras. So we'll say what that means is that if you eat a certain amount of food, or I should say, if you eat a food over a certain amount of time, we are confident that you have consumed a kizayis of prohibited material. Right? So if that concept is really biblically true, and everyone subscribes to it, watch this, then why do the Rabbanon argue on Rabbi Elazar about kusach habavli? But remember again, what's kusach? Everyone's favorite. It's a crowd pleaser, right? Remember again, moldy milk or curdled milk, moldy bread, right? Mixed together. Now watch this. So why does Rabbi Elazar argue on kusach? Now watch this. Take a look at the Rush for just a moment. The Rush says over here, he says, Ihach polig rabban alei Rabbi Elazar kusa nehinami delo darshi kol l'rabbo seilubo ha'achol kizayis diachilas pras. Shabbos say, why does Rabbi Elazar argue on kusach habavli? Shabbos say, it sounds like Rabbi Elazar would hold that halacha l'maisa, if you were on Pesach to consume a kizayis of kusach, you would not be chayiv. But why? If kizayis b'chdei achilas pras is a biblically agreed upon concept, then why Rabbi Elazar describes say, watch this. Hanach l'kusach habavli. So Amalei, he says, leave kusach habavli alone. Why? Rabbi Elazar, listen to this. Deleka kizayis b'chdei achilas pras. Rabbi Elazar say, in fact, it's not true. When you consume kusach, it's not kizayis b'chdei achilas pras. Rabbi Elazar say, why not? This is incredible. Either kasharifle mishraf, batla daita itzak aladam. Rabbi say, listen to this. If you gulp kusach, Rabbi say, you're not chayiv. Why are you not chayiv? That's not a normal act of consumption, right? Kusach is not gulped. Rabbi say, what is kusach? Kusach is a dip. So therefore, if you gulp it, that's called a non-normative act of eating. Rabbi say, in general, whenever it comes to an isra achila, you're only chayiv for consumption in a normative fashion. Therefore, gulping kusach, even if you eat a kizayis of bread, you're not going to be chayiv for Pesach on that. Mishtar kashoter, and if you dip, lo mishkachas kizayis b'chdei achilas pras. All it is fascinating. If you dip, you actually will not get a kizayis of bread b'chdei achilas pras, which makes sense because since it's a dip, by definition, you're not really getting a kizayis of bread in that prohibited amount of time. Fine. So we'll say Isvei, another kasha. So we'll say, so again, remember, just to keep in mind, how do we get here? You're like, I was thinking the exact same question, right? How did we get here? We'll say, so remember, Rav Dimi was sitting and giving over the statement of Rabbi Yochanan. What did Rabbi Yochanan say? That heter mitzaref le'isser only where? By Nazir. Why by Nazir? Mishras. Excellent. Mishras. Abaye said, not true. He brought up the case of porridge. He thought the reason why Evesi Yisrael eats porridge, grain is chulin, oil and garlic is truma, and the Yisrael eats it, he gets malchus. Why does he get malchus? Abaye thought the reason was why Rabbi say heter mitzaref le'isser. It turns out that's not the reason. Why does the Yisrael get Malchus in this case? We'll say why. Ultimately, why? Because of Kizayis Bichdei Achilas Pras. Now the Gemara kind of went off on a tangent. Wow, is that true? Does everyone agree with Kizayis Bichdei Achilas Pras? So we'll say, it seems here, according to the Gemara, that yes, everyone agrees that Midoraisa there is this concept of Kizayis Bichdei Achilas Pras. It doesn't apply to Kusach for reasons we just mentioned. Fine. Right now, there's another kasha. Esvei, Shtei Meduchos. We'll say fascinating case. Shtei Meduchos. So we'll say a Meducha is a mortar. Mortar, I was going to say a press, right? A mortar. You're grinding herbs. You're grinding spices. So we'll say, so watch this. You have two mortars, and right, Acha shal Truma v'Acha shal Chulin. And I will say, on one of the mortars, you're grinding up Truma spices. On one of the mortars, you're grinding up Chulin spices. Fine, no problem so far, right? Ulefan of shtei kaderos, and in front of you have two pots of food. Achas shal Truma v'Acha shal Chulin. Oh, so you already see how this is going to go south, right? So I'll say, so what happens? Now you have two pots of food in front of you. One of Chulin, one of Truma. I'll say, obviously now, what's the intention over here? What's the intention? Truma spices for the Truma pot. Chulin spices for the Chulin pot. That's my intention. Now what happens? V'naflu elu l'soch elu. So I'll say, so now what ends up happening? So spices end up getting put into each of the pot. What don't I know? I don't know specifically which spices went where. So we'll say, what's the halacha? Shteihen mutaros. Both of the pots are going to be mutar. Why? Shani omer, chulin l'soch, chulin naflu, u'truma l'soch, truma nafla. Let's say, so ultimately, again, I assume everything is fine, because halacha might say, I assume the truma went into the truma, ultimately, again, the chulin went into the chulin. Beautiful, I will say. By the way, there's a beautiful musar. In that halacha as well. What's the musar in there? In life, you just have to assume that things are going to be good. That's the default, right? The default at the end of the day, things are good. Things are going to fall into place. That has to be the default approach to life. Now, does it always happen that way? It doesn't. Rabbi say, see, the hashkafa of a Jew is, I have to assume naflu elu l'soch elu. Everything falls into place. When it doesn't, that's an aberration. Right? So there are some people who go through life and they always assume something's going to go wrong. Right? That's their assumption. Like the default is things don't work. Now that could be a result of their life experiences or their perception of their life experiences. And when you meet people like that, generally, they're not all that pleasant to be around. So halacha l'maaseh, the Gemara teaches us, this is the halacha. You have to assume naflu elu l'soch elu. In life, everything works out. Right? Maybe not immediately, maybe it takes some time, maybe I see it, maybe I don't see it, I understand it, I don't understand it, but that's the default approach of the Jew. Everything works out, everything falls into place. Incredible. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Shabbos said, I watch this. But if you hold the concept ultimately again of that kizayis b'chtei achilas pras, ultimately again is an actual isra d'oraisa, then I understand how can you be mekel and just assume that the truma spices fell into the truma pot and the chulin spices fell into the chulin pot. In other words, I would say it's possible then that the truma spices fell into the chulin pot, and I'm going to end up eating truma b'chtei achilas pras. So what the Gemara is asking, in other words, if it's really true what you said, that the concept of kizayis b'chtei achilas pras is an isser d'oraisa, then I just don't understand how you could just be makel in this case and assume that everything fell into the pot that it was destined for. Well, say, take a quick look at Rashi. It's almost right across him. Now, it is right across him, Rashi. How can you be so makel here? The Amr Shani Omer, Truma L'soch Truma Nafla, V'lo L'soch Chulin, V'ika L'mechash, Shema Nafla B'shal Chulin, V'ika Kizayis De'achis. And I was about to say, what the Gemara is saying, if you tell me, like we just said before, that the concept of Kizayis B'chtei Achilas Pras is in fact an Isser D'oraisa, then I don't understand that you could just be makel to say, oh yeah, the Chulin fell into the Chulin, the Truma fell into the Truma. Maybe not, it's a suffix. Maybe the Truma fell into the Chulin, and now when you're eating your Truma food, it turns out that what? You're going to eat a kizayis of truma b'chtei achilas pras, and that is a very serious transgression. To which the Gemara says, Elamai, rather, what do you have to say? Elamai, heter mitztaref le'isr. So I will say, so ultimately, again, what must it be? Going back before the Gemara says, it must be that halacha l'maisa, we really subscribe to the concept of heter mitztaref le'isr. So I will say, so ultimately, again, if that's the case, I'm sorry, Elamai, heter mitztaref le'isr, amai aminan shani omer. So I will say, it's actually a very interesting argument the Gemara is constructing. So now watch this. It must be that we don't hold that kizayis b'chtei achilas pras is an isur d'oraisa. If kizayis b'chtei achilas pras is not an isur d'oraisa, then I was going back to the previous case of the mikveh. It must be get ready for this. It must be that the reason the zar is not allowed gets malchus if he ate it is why is because of heter mitztaref le'isur. But again, I will say either way. I'm still back to my original question. Why are you allowed to eat this pot of food now? In other words, we'll say, halacha l'maisa. So all the Gemara just did, I will say, is just went back and reversed its position on the previous case. Remember, by the mikveh case, we said that is not a case of heter mistarif le'isur. Instead, what is it? Kizayis b'chtei achilas pras. The Gemara is saying, now, it must be we don't hold kizayis b'chtei achilas pras. Because if you hold that kizayis b'chtei achilas pras is really what? Is really an isur d'oraisa, then why can you assume that the truma spices fell into the truma food? I should have to assume the worst, namely, that the truma spices fell into the chulin food, and it should be asur for me to eat it. Rather, it must be that we don't hold kizayis b'chtei achilas pras is an isur d'oraisa. Well, if I reject that, then the mikveh case must be a case of heter mistarif le'isr. Okay, but still back to the truma case. How do I reconcile this? I will say very simple. Halach hanach l'trumas tavlin d'rabbanani. I will say Gemara says getting worked up for nothing. I will say this is a case of spices. Truma does not apply to spices midaraisa. I will say it's actually very interesting. Do you know the only thing truma applies to midaraisa? The Rosh points out over here, Tereishis degancha v'siroshcha v'yitzarecha. Ultimately, I will say the only thing that truma applies to midaraisa is wheat, olives, grapes. Right? Wheat, olives, grapes. Midrabanan, we say that truma applies to spices. Oh, okay. So now I get it. I will say, so what's the case is, right? 2 mortars grinding up spices, one of truma, one of chulin, 2 pots of food, one of truma, one of chulin. The spices are put into the pots. We don't know which pot it was put into. I will say, what do I have over here? A safek d'rabbanan. Oh, okay. Whew. I can breathe so much easier now. Right? Safek d'rabbanan. No problem. I will say, how do you resolve a safek d'rabbanan? L'kula. Beautiful. The world is good. So we'll say, Eisvei. Where is another kasha? Shtei kupos, achal shel truma v'achal shel chulin. So I said, now watch this. I have 2 baskets. One of truma, one of chulin. V'lifneyen shtei si'in. And I will say in front of me, I have 2 measuring utensils. Achal shel chulin v'achal shel truma. One of them is truma, one of them is chulin. So we'll say similar case. So we'll say, so if you can imagine, again, I have two, we'll call it two kupos. 2 large baskets. One of chulin, one of truma. Then I also have 2 smaller measuring utensils. One of chulin, one of truma. And I will say, what happens? Same case. V'naflu elu soch elu. And I will say, so what happens? And the 2 measuring utensils are emptied into the 2 larger baskets. So I will say, so what's the halacha? Shneihen mutarin, sha'ani omer chulin l'soch chulin naflu, truma l'soch truma naflu. So I will say, they're both mutter. Why are they both mutter? Because I assume that what? I assume the truma was emptied into the truma basket, the chulin was emptied into the chulin basket. Beautiful, good. So Gemara says, whoa. Pras aser amaya minan shani omer. So I will say, so one second. If you hold that gezayis b'chtei achilas pras is an isur d'oraisa, then again I will say once again, how could you assume that the truma was emptied into the truma, the chulin emptied into the chulin? Maybe the truma was emptied into the chulin, and now what? I'm going to eat the chulin, and it's going to turn out I'm going to eat a gezayis of truma b'chtei achilas pras. So what's going on over here? So top of Lam Zayin, Bishlama l'didi damina mishum dehet misarif le'isser. So I will say, according to me, who holds that ultimately, again, heter misarif le'isser is really a concept. I could explain this case by saying, Kigon denefishi chulin. where there's a lot of chulin, much more chulin than Isser, and therefore maybe we don't say heter mitzaref Isser in this case. I will say we have not discussed this, but I'll just mention it in passing. There is this concept ultimately again that halacha l'maisa, maybe the concept of heter mitzaref Isser only applies where there's some equality or equal amounts, but if there's much more chulin than Isser, ultimately again maybe you don't say heter mitzaref Isser. But according to you who say that kizayis de'achilas pras is a real issue, how do you reconcile this case? We'll say let's finish up. Amarle hanach l'trum bizman hazeh d'Rabbanan. We'll say so. We'll stop with this today. So halacha ma'aseh says no, don't get worked up about this case. We'll say watch this, because even though this is a grain case, and what did we just say before about the grain case? What did we just say before? That's truma d'ra oraisa. We'll say watch this. Truma bizman hazeh is d'Rabbanan. Truma is only rabbinic. We both say, why is Truma only rabbinic? So we're going to see Meretz Hashem tomorrow that the Rambam Paskins, Truma is only d'oraisa when all of Klal Yisrael is in Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, it turns out that what Rabbi say, what do I really have? A Safek d'Rabbanan, Safek d'Rabbanan Kula. Say Rabbi say, just what we're left off with, right? Three major concepts. Number one, Heter Mistarif L'Isser, Machlokis when it applies. Kizayis Bichdei Achilas Pras, Machlokes, whether or not, again, that's an Isser D'Oraisa or an Isser D'Rabbanan. So we'll say, again, those two major concepts ultimately are still outstanding. And there's Hashem, resolution tomorrow. What a daf. Shkayach. All right, Chav Ranzum, have a great day, everyone.